unspeakable evil, depravity, degeneracy stops all the Western countries in particular. The evil that is abroad is scarcely to be believed, belonging as it does in the worst dystopian novels of yesteryear. No one could have predicted the kind of evil we saw in the Gaza Strip this week, where a double tap, or as the BBC put it, a double strike. They only use double tap when it's an enemy country that's doing the double tapping. Slaughtered medics, rescue workers, and of course journalists, 6 of them murdered on one day in a double tap deliberately carried out in broad daylight and live on television. Israel first said it was a mishap, I think was the word that Netanyahu used. Losing your car keys or stubbing your toe could easily be described as a mishap. But that's what Netanyahu called the mass murder of at least 20 people in a hospital. The hospitals they used to claim they would never bomb, just before they destroyed every single last hospital in Gaza. The hospitals they used to claim were hit either by Hamas rockets or by, a mishap. Well, this was no mishap, because as the Israeli media, always reliable in a way that Western media simply is not, to tell the truth, says that it was a deliberate targeting and that it was green-lighted at the highest level of the military command. And, moreover, Netanyahu's tune has changed. They thought it was a Hamas camera. Now, I've heard of Leica, I've heard of Sony, I've heard of all kinds of cameras, but a Hamas camera is a new one on me. Not only are the children in Gaza murdered because, if they're not Hamas now, they'll grow up to be. Even the cameras held by the journalists in press vests are now described as Hamas cameras. What can you say about the evil in Minneapolis? We don't know much yet about Robin Westman, but I'm accentuating his name because there are people out there who are desperate for these kind of crimes to have been committed by a Muslim. Well, this one definitely was not. I don't want to fuel speculation as to the motives of this mass murderer. No doubt more will come out in the hours and days to come. But he was no Muslim, bruv. He carried out mass murder on little children, celebrating mass to open the new school year at the parish of Asuncion in Minneapolis. What kind of mental illness is that? What kind of fanatic politics is that, if indeed politics were in any way involved? One thing is for sure. The United States is looking more and more like a banana republic, as indeed is the United Kingdom. Oscar Wilde said we were 2 countries divided by a common language. But actually we are increasingly united, not just by our common language, but by the common dysfunctionality of our political systems. When we've got Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, as at the current rate of opinion poll ratings we'll have Trump on one side of the Atlantic, and we'll have Nigel Farage on the other, who will immediately begin the Trumpification of the United Kingdom, killing the very last vestiges, and they are the last, and they are only vestiges of civilization in our country. The American ambassador to Lebanon was fond of the word civilization and animalistic in his disastrous press conference in Beirut this week. He has a team in Lebanon. No one's quite clear why. no one's quite clear what Lebanon has to do with him, and nobody at all is clear why Lindsey Graham is a part of the ambassador's team. But he waded into this press conference and lectured the Arab journalists present as uncivilized and animalistic. Now, I don't know exactly how old you would place American civilization, if civilization it is, after today's events in Minneapolis. I'm reminded of Mr. Gandhi's famous riposte when asked by an American journalist what he thought of Western civilization. He replied, "Yes, I think that would be a good idea." But if you are of a mind to trace Western American civilization to the conquest of North America by, primarily in the first instance, Anglo-Saxon settlers, joined by European settlers from virtually all European countries, if that's the beginning of your civilization, let me tell you that Iraq had the world's greatest library when our people were painting their faces blue and living in the forest. When the Mongol hordes invaded Baghdad and sacked the city, it's said that the river Tigris turned two colors within that very day. First, black with the ink of the greatest library that was destroyed by the hordes, and then red with the blood of its defenders. The idea that any plenipotentiary of the United States of America can lecture anybody, never mind the Arab people, about civilization and about animalistic behavior is not just almost incomprehensible, it is, insofar as it's comprehensible, the root of the Orientalist attitudes which have disfigured so much of the world. But it's not just the peoples of the East of the globe. It's the peoples of the East of Europe. If you look at a pattern of the people murdered in the 20th century by war, by wars and invasions, the overwhelming majority of them are Slavic people. Hitler was determined to completely annihilate, to eliminate all the Slavs of Europe once he had worked to death those that were physically capable of such work. Those that were not were to be marched into the Zyklon B showers in the death camps and massacred, annihilated, because they wanted no extra mouths to feed. And I mention that because Poland has at last joined, maybe it's the recent political changes, has at last realized that the Ukrainian nationalist fronts that they have been supporting and facilitating throughout this last 11 years of war in Ukraine are the same people that massacred 1 million Poles, 1 million Poles, hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Holocaust of the East, and that the foundational figures in that Ukrainian nationalist government, Bandera being only the most preeminently evil, are the very people who could not wait for the SS to arrive before they began to fall upon their neighbors in the western part of Ukraine and annihilate them, massacre them, up close and personal, no gas chambers, no death camps, just a bullet in the back of the head if you were lucky, having been stripped and raped if you were a female. The fact that we have destroyed the entire European economy in support of these people would be, as I said, almost incomprehensible, except that new documents emerged this week which demonstrated that Britain and the United States secretly transferred 9,000 SS fighters from the Ukrainian Galician brigades to Canada. To Canada, part then of Britain's dominions, were secretly transferred. They took off their SS uniforms. Then Britain and America secretly transferred them to Canada. And one of them, you may recall, ended up getting a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament for having fought the Russians during the Second World War. I'm not making this up for younger viewers. Check it out. He got a standing ovation from Trudeau, from all parties. Standing ovation because he had fought the Russians during the Second World War. It didn't dawn on any of them. If he was fighting the Russians in the Second World War, he was fighting on the side of the Nazis. I mention all of this because I now discover that the welfare state in Germany can no longer be afforded, says the Chancellor, Herr Merz. This is a country that has given billions, tens of billions of euros to Zelensky in Ukraine, much of which he has stolen. He has a property portfolio, according to his former head of anti-corruption, of 1.5 billion euros. Of course, she says, on paper, Zelensky has nothing. But in reality, her words, Zelensky has everything. Tens of billions have been given by Germany to Zelensky, much of it stolen, and now Germany announces it can no longer afford its welfare state. The British people, under a so-called Labour government, are being prepared not just for yet another tidal wave of austerity, but a cap-in-hand trip to the IMF in Washington for a bailout. We have no money to keep energy bills down, to repair the absolute decrepitude of our country, our society, and our economy, but we are so flush with money that we cannot give enough of it to the chiseling little crook, the thief of Kiev. This week, the head of the British Army and the head of the British Air Force were both in Kiev in talks with little Zelensky about how yet still more of our money and, if necessary, more of the blood of our brave young men and women in the armed services can be shed, can be burned in the cause of Bandera, of the people of the Holocaust of the East, of the Einsatzgruppen, of the SS flags, emblems, death heads, Sieg Heil salutes, jack boots. How did we end up in this situation? Well, no doubt our excellent guest tonight will help us understand it. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is still throwing weapons into the slaughter in Ukraine. It now turns out that Ukraine has lost 1.7 million men. Not my figures, their figures. 1.7 million. This is World War I levels of casualty. Missing in action, killed in action, permanently disabled, deserted, 250,000 deserted, 1.7 million. 9 million Ukrainians living at other people's expenses in impoverishing Western European countries like Ireland, like Britain, like Germany. They're dragging people in front of their children by the hair to the front lines, whilst millions of them are living in our countries, paid by us, living in hotels, fast-tracked through the airports, and the better off of them driving the very best cars in Europe, hanging out in the very chicest places. How, I ask again, did we get to this situation? There's so many flashpoints right now that both Larry Johnson and Colonel Douglas Macgregor will be hard pushed to get through them all. We're facing the real possibility of all-out war, hypersonically ballistic war between Iran and Israel. And for Israel, read America. Any time now. The Russians have evacuated their embassy from Tel Aviv. The Americans have evacuated their military bases in Iraq. It could happen tonight or tomorrow. War in Ukraine is the reason why the Russians are moving their nuclear weapons and why the United States has secretly installed thermonuclear weapons on British soil in secret, undeclared, with no parliamentary approval or even discussion. No member of parliament has told you what I've just told you. England, Lakenheath, is now nuclear war central. What's it all about? Let's hear what Larry Johnson thinks coming up right after this.